Welcome to Sorry Not Sorry, where we unapologetically talk about Christianity and culture from a Pentecostal perspective. Today we've got Dr. Bruce Marino with us. We're going to interview him in just a few minutes here. And when we decided we were going to discuss the problem of evil, you know, he came to mind. I don't.
I know. What does that mean?
Wait, that didn't quite come. You know, really, we're all experts in evil.
I mean, the truth.
It is.
Preach, brother.
We are.
Come on, that's it.
Right. So, but it's going to be good. Bruce is a good friend, and he's a brilliant scholar, and I'm really excited to hear what he has to say.
I mean, this has been, I think, for a lot of us, an ongoing conversation. I mean, the problem of evil is really difficult because I personally have never really heard a good answer. There are things in which we maybe submit to, the ideas of sovereignty, the free will argument when it comes to moral evil. There's definitely things that I think work and we feel somewhat comfortable with, but anytime we can have this conversation honestly, I think it's healthy. It's important because I think a lot of Christians don't want to deal with it.
That's right. That's right. And that's the whole purpose of this podcast is we just want to talk about these things. We want to help people formulate orthodox ideas, we hope, about what they believe, and we're trying really hard to tone down the heresy. You know, we're doing our best.
Week by week, we're going to get a little bit better.
That's right. So we're excited to have my good friend Dr. Bruce Marino with us, and this other guy sitting across the table from me. Hey. Who are you, sir? What is your
Dom Garcia? Still here.
Garcia.
Still
that's
there.
right.
Haven't kicked me out yet. We should start like a little countdown for how many episodes I've survived.
That's right.
You know what I mean? Because we know at one point they're just going to finally kick me out. So that's almost two.
We could keep lowering your chair.
Exactly. Until finally I'm just out of frame. You don't even barely hear me in the distance.
It'll never happen. So, and so today we're going to talk about the problem of evil, or as theologians call it, theodicy. And this actually is, before we dive into things, this actually is something that I have kind of a personal connection to, because I turned my back on faith directly as a result of what I perceived to be the problem of evil. When I had a sister who died when she was 14 years old of cancer, I was about 21 at the time, and I remember at her funeral looking at her body laying in this casket and being aware of what cancer had done to her since she was just a small child. And I remember looking at her and thinking about that and saying to myself, there cannot be an all-loving, all-powerful God. I just cannot reconcile it with what's before me. And so this is something it's an issue that I think a lot of people deal with, and it's something that I can relate to. I think a lot of people can.
Absolutely.
And so, Dr. Marino, why don't you just give us a definition of the problem of evil? When somebody says it from an apologetic perspective, talks about the problem of evil, what are they talking about?
Well, how does suffering happen in a world where God is all good, where he's all-powerful and all-knowing? Because if he was really that good and all-knowing and all-powerful, this wouldn't be like this. You know, we wouldn't have tragedies.
Yeah, exactly. Like with my sister,
Yep.
The same thing. Or it doesn't have to be disease. It could be, something as big as war, or as small as seemingly small on a grand scale as a broken relationship. Why do bad things happen to good people? Right. Dom, any?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we were talking about even before is that sometimes there are things that are out of our control. There's natural disasters, right? I mean, there's the issue of the moral, but there's also the natural. And so how does, even when we discuss the fall, I mean, there's this ongoing tension of God is in control, right? And because of our sin, we're in this state. But what about someone who loses a loved one because of a hurricane or an earthquake or a myriad of other things that are completely out of our control and don't seem to play into moral evil, but natural evil? Mm-hmm. Like, how does that? Even that to me is always an interesting question.
Yeah, absolutely. Like another example would be we have some good missionary friends who their whole life served in really difficult places in Africa. About a year before they were going to retire and come home to finally, after 40 some years living in Africa, we're going to finally come home to spend time with their grandkids. She gets sick and dies right before all of this happens. And you see this and you think, like, it's just mind-boggling. Like, why would a loving, compassionate God allow something like that to happen? And so the crux of the issue then, when we're talking about the problem of evil, really is either God is not all loving, and either he's not all loving, or he's not all powerful.
Or he doesn't know everything.
Or he doesn't know everything.
Ooh, open
right.
theism. Are we going to do it? Are we going there?
I'm ready.
We're just going to ride the train wherever it goes. So,
That's heretical quick. We're like less than 5 minutes in.
Maybe a practical analogy.
Yes.
If, imagine yourself as a kid, if mom or dad ever allowed the things to happen to you that God allows to happen to us, you wouldn't think they were doing a good job.
Right, right. So is there a biblical response to this? What do we say to people who are dealing with this issue, who are struggling with looking at the world and seeing the world getting worse, seeing wars, seeing climate change, tragedy everywhere, and saying, how could there be an omnipotent God in the midst of all this mess?
And can we give them an answer that this is going to be difficult, that has a little more, not more substance, but that is something that is a little bit more reassuring than just sovereignty? Because that is such an easy answer, and we give it all the time, and it is truth.
Right.
But my goodness, to just immediately point everybody to Job and go, he's sovereign, and walk away, doesn't deal with the issue.
And it doesn't really help anybody.
No,
you know?
it doesn't.
I mean,
the word does, but like, it's just, anyway, it's like
God's all powerful, therefore accept it.
Deal with it.
Yeah, right.
Like, just deal with it.
Right.
His ways are higher, deal with it.
Yeah.
It's such a reformed approach. It's like, what are you going to do with this?
You might want to explain reformed in that context.
Well, the idea of course, is that God is sovereign and that he's predestined everything, and that most of the time they lean upon the idea of his ways being higher when it comes to predestination and especially election. And so then play into almost every other area, including the problem of evil, is my understanding.
Yeah, and so to be clear, like, Arminians and Reformed approaches to theology fully appreciate and fully acknowledge that God is sovereign.
Yes.
No Orthodox tradition denies the sovereignty of God. The difference would be that in the Reformed tradition, people would be more inclined to say God caused this, whereas in the Arminian tradition, people would be more likely to say God allowed this.
And free will is a huge part of the argument.
That's right. So what is there any comfort for somebody who is wrestling with this in a real sense, from a Christian perspective?
May I go back to a prior life?
Absolutely. Wow, this is really getting interesting.
Yes, different voice coming. Before I was a theologian, I did counseling and psychology. And so my argument on a practical level would be that you don't start by giving answers. You start by caring for, loving for, empathizing with, and trying to be there for the person. Otherwise, it rings really hollow, even if it's a great answer. We need to be people first, and we'll get to this when we talk about Job, but the idea that Jesus comes down to the earth. My God, literally my God. So that's a preamble to all the technical, intellectual stuff, which I love. But it doesn't work without that. So then I think evil is undeniable, although some people deny it. There are certain positions, not within Orthodox Christianity, that believe it's an illusion. There is a rumor that Mary Baker Eddy has a live telephone in her tomb, so that when she realizes that death is an illusion, she can call up for, limo and pizza. But all those multiple positions. But we would be here all week if we played with those, but just as an FYI. So I think a couple of things. One, you've got to look all the way back to the fall. What happened, not with Adam and Eve, because really that's the second fall. What happened with Satan?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay, and
We're going to qualify that we believe in a personified evil, which is Satan.
yes, we do.
So we do, just for qualification for the audience.
We do.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that you really have to ask is not why did humanity fall, but why did Satan fall if he fell? And we can use that word. My argument is that angels are a really odd group of creatures. They're created. They haven't always been, or else they'd be like God.
Kind of like the three of us, actually.
Yeah, so we have more limited abilities so far.
You can sing the song of the redeemed,
Yeah,
thank the Lord.
that's
so
right.
That's the good thing.
And I don't know about the chorus, but
I don't
I
know.
would not do well.
That's right.
And so my argument, and it's kind of like several points all at once, so forgive me, is that God can't do the impossible. Sorry about the chorus not being working anymore. But God can't do the impossible. So, for instance, God cannot be evil. Scripture says he cannot lie. When it does say about doing the impossible, it's relatively speaking in terms of our perception of the miraculous. So he can't deny himself. And God ultimately must be logical.
So he can't do that which is contrary to his own nature, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if he could, he wouldn't be God.
That's right.
So that would be problematic. So it is better for God, who deserves anything, to have people who can worship him freely. And which brings us to the inflatable robot spouse theory. So if it's right just before spring banquet, and you've got a 4.0 average, everything is wonderful, great job, you're a senior, you're about to take off, but you're not going to spring banquet because you're totally depressed because you don't have a significant other. And so you go on the web and you try to find the inflatable robot spouse. And for only 3,472 payments of $19.95, you can get an inflatable robot spouse. He or she is, in fact, everything perfectly programmable, everything you'd ever want them to be, right? So, ladies, you can make them polite. Gentlemen, they can have a volume control. I mean, this is exactly the person you want in every detail. And I am stereotyping, and I know.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's for the sake of communication. Yeah. And of course, the argument is you wouldn't want an inflatable robot spouse because although you could get the perfect one, they wouldn't love you. And part of the idea that they wouldn't love you is because they couldn't reject you. Therefore, it seems that if God doesn't want, remember where he said, let the stones cry out? He doesn't want to just rely on stones, but in fact, he wants people who can truly love him. Then you have to have this idea of evil because evil is fundamentally the rejection of God. Okay, and that's, I think, this fundamental idea.
Yeah, I think that's the, to me, I think that's what it all boils down to is, and two things I want to comment on what you said. I think for those who may say, okay, well, what's your biblical evidence about the first fall? I think there is a good argument to be made that something tangibly different exists between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, in that the Spirit of God is hovering above the waters, and many commentators will point out that in Hebrew literature, the water was a place of chaos, and so there's embedded in this context this notion that there was present there chaos, and that God is intervening in creation to bring order where there was disorder. And so a lot of people see in those two verses evidence for the fall, and I think it's a legitimate inference.
The tohu vabohu, God brings order.
Right.
And if one thinks of it, God is, and I know a lot of my friends hate this, but God is by definition orderly, because if he's not, he's random. And a random God is not God. And then you have the serpent in 3, and then all the way in Revelation 12:9, is it? You have the serpent identified as the original evil. So from one end of Scripture to the other.
Yeah, and I think this is a good thing thing for people to hear Pentecostals saying is that God is a God of order, and Orthodox Pentecostalism ought to believe that, because it's the whole point that Paul is making in 1 Corinthians.
Decency and good order.
That's right. And so, he's not to get off track, he's not squashing the gifts, but he's calling for them to be done in a certain order. And so, I think there's two things. I once heard somebody say that evil plays for theism. And so if you're going to talk about the problem of evil, you can only really do so from a theistic worldview. From an atheistic and naturalistic worldview, you can't even call something evil, because you don't have the tools by which to say that.
Morality. It's completely relativistic if you take God out of the equation.
It's what I don't like.
It really is.
Yeah,
it's does open it up for all kinds of beliefs.
Exactly.
On a purely naturalistic evolutionary scale, you cannot possibly have something called evil. You can only have, this is how things turned out. And it doesn't really matter whether you like it or not, because nobody's asking you.
And contextually, you can look and say, well, this is for the greater good, but can you really question whether it is moral, just, and or evil? It is just an issue that the majority of people, it helps. But again, that's right. Purely contextual, and that could lead to a lot of issues, as we've seen in a lot of societies.
Yeah, and so I think the Christian argument here would be that God created precisely the world in which there exists the least amount of evil and the most opportunity for people to freely love him and respond to his offer of salvation. Would you?
Without being able to freely love him, what's the point?
That's right.
In this whole astonishing thing, and we could go into the physics, but this whole astonishing universe, maybe multiple universes, I would argue, does have the point of glorifying God. He's the only person that everything can glorify and ought to. So I would even go so far as to say that things like the lake of fire, or hell as it's sometimes less precisely called, glorifies God and is good. So because people are getting what they want, and they wouldn't want to be near God. And so they get to essentially be gods to themselves.
Right. Like C.S. Lewis's statement that I believe it was in The Great Divorce, that hell is locked from the inside. He's such a master of images, and the picture he presents of hell, I think, is really interesting. It's this picture of a bus that people can get on or not get on, that every day goes from hell to heaven. But as the people are waiting in line, they start fighting with each other, and they start worrying about things back at home or whatever, and for one reason or another, nobody ever makes it on the bus. And I think that's not far from what you see like in the book of Revelation. You see God over and over again giving people an opportunity to respond to calamity by turning to him and trusting in him. And the picture in Revelation is that people actually, in the midst of that, they grow more rebellious. And so there's a sense in which God says, you know what? I'm not going to force your hand. I love you. I want to be in a saving relationship with you, but ultimately it's meaningless unless you decide to enter into that relationship.
Absolutely. So two things, and I was so excited when I heard that you were going to be here, so thank you so much. This is just a blast. But two of the questions I had, the first one is in Romans 9, it talks about how, obviously, always going to go there, any good Reformed theologian, and God can make an object of wrath, right? He talks about the potter. How does that work when it comes to creating something to love you? Again, this is the sovereignty argument, right? That he can do with us as he wills. Thoughts? Because to me, that seems incredibly problematic and not loving.
In the same passage where he talks about Pharaoh.
Right, yeah, hardens his heart.
Hardens his heart.
Right, but he gives him the choice. There's enough choices with Pharaoh, or maybe not. I don't know. Please, elaborate. Thoughts?
You have to go back in the Old Testament to appreciate those things. Because if you look at the potter analogies, they have a choice. Interestingly. The second thing is, God does harden people's hearts. The King James does not do a good job here, but I usually like it. It's pretty. But it talks about how Pharaoh's heart being hardened. Actually, Pharaoh originally hardened his own heart, and then God comes on the scene. So one of my maybe not widely held bits of theology is that, in fact, the unpardonable sin is something you have to commit to be committed to the lake of fire. So to be damned, you have to have done that. And that the ontological, the essence of the unpardonable sin is that you've denied the Holy Spirit so often, so regularly, etc., that...
Kind of the idea that there's a point of no return.
But that point of no return is the ultimate destruction of the imago Dei within you. Because it remains after the fall.
Oh, yeah.
It can still be built up,
right,
which is all throughout the New Testament. But if that's true, then the rejection of God, it can be torn down.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense.
And so when you don't have the image within you, you have no place to communicate with God. You effectively live in an atheistic universe. And this also does remove the problem of having like the image of God bobbing up and down in the lake of fire from all these doomed people. So in a sense, when you lose the image of God, that which makes you truly valuable, you cease to be really human. And so it's really this deep terror.
Yeah, we're kind of going down this road, so let's maybe hit this head on.
Okay.
Satan.
That's where I was gonna. Where does evil come from? I mean, I'm like, even, we get to the issue on this side of things, but it seems like he makes a choice, right? I mean, doesn't he? But if the choice is to be made, that means there's something that precedes him. I'm asking, like, I'm not making, I mean, it sounds like a declarative statement, but I'm just trying to, that's been my ongoing question. And I submit to the sovereignty of God on this one. But but help me understand.
As do we all.
Exactly. How an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God, right? I mean, the whole is the absence of the wall. I've never loved that analogy. I mean, I understand it, but like, how does Satan choose something that doesn't exist before him?
Because, okay, so Augustine's the absence of good argument.
Right.
And can I just tweak that for the information age?
Please.
Without salt, we would be dead. But salt, of course, and we should do the video on this, is made of sodium and chloride, right? You toss sodium into water, nice explosion. Chlorine bleach is only a couple of percent bleach and chlorine, and actually the rest water. You do either of those to your body, you're going to die. Okay. In fact, chlorine was a poison gas in World War I. So I would argue, and this goes back to one of our earlier points, that really sin is the disordering of the good. It's when you don't have things in order. Hence, sex is great as long as you do it within the orderly structure of marriage. And of course, what does happen at Genesis is he takes the tohu vabohu and brings order to it.
So it existed in the sense that it's the disorder.
He creates.
It's not another entity, or
right.
It's
That's the corruption of what was good.
Is that Augustinian? I mean, that's.
He would say the absence of good.
Oh, okay, yeah, because that was
I think it would be more precise to say this. It's more useful.
Yeah.
Okay, and then of course, if you read like Leviticus 18 through 20, the holiness code, and you got to wonder why, tossing your kid into the fire of Moloch and wearing two different materials in your outfit both deserve the same terrible end.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, the only way that makes sense is because the whole thing is themed around seed and not confusing or misusing it, which goes all the way back to pulling the seed off the tree in Genesis. And of course, then Isaiah says,
let me just unpack that a little bit. So the idea then is because I think this comes up a lot in atheist websites and things, when people will post, a passage from Leviticus saying, railing against homosexuality, and the atheist website will say, well, if you believe that, shouldn't you also not wear polyester and also not get a tattoo? Right. But the point you're making is that, and I think this is a really good one, is that the prohibition against the mixed fabrics is that this, what lies behind it.
Yes, the seed being mixed, the seed in the field, because you don't mix them in the field.
Right.
And so the whole thing is you misuse seed in Eden, and so we need to keep seed as creativity of God, and so we need to keep things in order. And so Isaiah says, "Come, let us reason together." And of course, logos can also mean not just word, but reason. Okay, and so then, of course, in the crucifixion, what do you see? You see God's seed, Jesus, being put back on the tree. And then we can eat it properly. We didn't do proper eating of the fruit on the tree in Eden, but now we can in the crucifixion and the resultant communion meal.
Wow.
Oh, that's good.
Cool.
Yeah,
That's
that's great.
interesting.
Yeah.
When you get to Revelation, you have the marriage supper of the Lamb, where order is restored to the universe. But of course, that does make sense, because if you read the synoptic accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of the first Passover communion, the Last Supper, you realize that he never finishes the fourth cup. And because there are usually 4 cups of wine at a Seder meal, even then. And so that first communion, that Last Supper, was never ever finished. It's only finished when everything is brought back into order at the marriage supper of the Lamb, where he will then finally drink the 4th cup. I will not touch the fruit of the vine again.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's excellent. You know, I'm just imagining people listening to this and just freaking out that 3 Pentecostals are talking about order.
I know, right? Seriously.
I grew up
This is
Episcopalian and Presbyterian.
Oh, okay. Well, that's where it comes
did
from.
I.
Okay.
I grew up Episcopalian as well.
And I went to Episcopal school, so
Yeah,
there you go.
so the smells and the bells.
That's where
I
it's
loved
coming
it.
from.
Yeah.
Okay,
So,
now I know where the order's coming from. High church, low church, we do it all.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so let's talk about, for a minute, the person of Satan. I think I once heard you talk about Satan in terms of his insanity. Could you
Sure.
describe that a little bit for us?
My argument is that God creates angels so the fall can happen, that they are a tool of God. They're this classic medieval phrase that Satan is God's ape, and he does what he wants.
So you're saying the fall is predestined, in a sense?
Yes, because if it wasn't predestined, God couldn't have creatures that could love him.
So it's part. Wow. Okay. So now you're combining. So it's predestined. Okay.
Because you want
that's like a Reform meets Arminian view.
Because you want
what is this, Molinism? What is it?
You want the greater good.
So
And the
you're
greater
okay.
good is for creatures who can love him.
Interesting.
Okay. So
So
my
the fall
argument
is predestined.
Yes, the fall is. But that's why people can be free. So Calvinism begets Arminianism, what can I say?
That's right.
So the argument then is that if all that is true, think about it, to do evil, whatever that is, in a world in which God exists, is madness. It's just plain out crazy. And of course, the craziest of all people, therefore, persons, must therefore be Satan. So I would argue, and this needs to be unpacked, there's a lot of details here. Trust me, my psych degree is in the background and it wants to talk, but we'll be here all day. But that madness and disobedience are the same thing. Okay, that it is irrational, let me put it that way, to go against God. And hence that's what evil is. And of course, irrationality is the disturbance of order. So all madness, all sin is disordering the universe. And God had to allow that because he can't do the impossible, and he wanted free creatures to be able to freely love him. And it is better, therefore, for some creatures to be free and love him, even if some people have to be, by their own will, dehumanized and left to the only thing they really want to be, a God and a God alone.
Yeah, that's good.
Now,
Yeah.
real quick, and this is going to be maybe a little bit of a tangent, but it's definitely something I think it's important.
theology.
Yeah, it is. Of course. What else are we
We're
doing
all
here?
about tangents.
Yeah, seriously. When you're thinking of, especially being a mental health professional as well as a theologian, but isn't it important for us, especially for our listeners who oftentimes probably will be younger, for us to make a distinction, though, between sin and someone needing mental health care? I mean, like, to say that madness and sin, right, you could, but I'm asking in a sense, like, because...
Speaking of the behaviors.
Okay, because we're not talking about, like, clinical depression or you know...
No, even clinical depression, people in my family have had some very serious psychological and mental illnesses, some which are genetic.
Right,
Okay?
exactly.
But even that genetic flaw goes back to the choice of Satan.
So we're saying it all stems from initially the fall.
Right, so this ultimate kind of thing. So I'm not holding people who struggle with mental illness.
Right, we're not saying that all mental illness is comparable to, like, demon possession,
or
right,
something.
or something,
Right,
right?
I'm saying that
trying to draw.
all irrationality is contrary to God. But there's sometimes reasons that people are pushed into being irrational.
Yeah,
Like, think of exam time.
right. That's very true.
That's right.
But like
We're all irrational.
right now online, I've seen some things, but I think it's really exciting. Young people talking about mental health, and they're talking about, especially from a faith-based perspective, you know, it's okay to have a therapist and Jesus.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I think that's an exciting, you know, statement. I think as our tradition oftentimes is, well, you just need to get deliverance, brother.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
yeah.
You just need to get the
And that's
victory.
not-
and that's not it. But it is.
It's not helpful, and it's probably not biblical.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But from a purely theoretical, philosophical, theological, not trying to talk practical, because we don't
Right.
want our young people to not get the help
Yes,
they need.
that's right.
But from a
I encourage it.
of course, absolutely, we all do. I think the question is, but are we saying that all of this stems from the fall? Like.
I am.
Yeah, I can
Please,
illustrate this.
please.
So I've struggled with depression off and on most of my life, and I actually had a doctor who really helped me get my head around it. And this is what he explained to me. And I think this is a little off topic, but it's important enough to say. I think that we should mention this. So, but what he said to me was he said I've never struggled with depression. He said, so I can't relate to what you're going through. He said, but here's how, if I were in your shoes, here's how I would view it. He said, I would think of it in the same context as if I were born without a leg, or if I had cancer. I would think of it as a physical disability that I have no control over. I didn't cause it, so I shouldn't feel guilty about it. Right. I didn't ask for it. I didn't seek it. It's just how I'm made. And so acknowledging that therefore means I should just do whatever I can to be healthy and to be whole and to be able to function, whatever that looks like, whether it's spiritual solutions or medical solutions, a combination of all that and psychological solutions, whatever. But that was a really helpful way to understand it for me. So just as we're finishing up here, so let's talk about then the person right now who's listening to this and is having a really hard time in the midst of their own pain. Maybe they lost a job, or they're in the midst of a divorce, or their spouse of 40, 50, 60 years has passed away, and they're very alone in the world, and they're having a hard time reconciling their circumstances with the tragedies that they're in the midst of. What is the church's message to them as it relates to all of this?
I think the church needs many messages because there are many people and many circumstances. One message that is always usable, but maybe not at the first, is this isn't it.
Yes.
Okay, because there is no... I mean, if Jesus suffered for 6 hours on the cross, would it be worse?
Right.
This finite life is nothing compared to an eternity in heaven. There's no horror. And we've had a couple.
That's right. And we talk about this. Yeah. I mean, as Christians, we profess our belief in eternity, but I think a lot of times, especially when it comes to death, we have a really hard time living that out in a practical way and embodying that. And that's not to say that we should just get over our grief or anything crazy like that, but that if we really do believe in the hope of heaven, then we have to acknowledge that this life isn't all there is.
Right. You and I have both lost our firstborn children.
Yes.
And I realized in this process, I mean, I knew it intellectually, but I realized in this process that it's still hard to talk about.
Yes, absolutely.
That I did ultimately not grieve for her, because Samantha is far better off than I would be. In fact, if I was a really good dad, I would say, yeah. But I grieved for myself because I had temporarily lost her. And you need to have this astonishingly supernatural worldview if you're a Christian, which is obviously necessarily true if you believe in God.
Yeah. When we lost our son, one of the things that helped me in my grief was one day I was actually driving in our Land Cruiser through southern Africa, and I had a vision of my son in heaven as I was driving. And it so shook me, I had to pull over to the side of the road, and I was weeping hysterically. But the details are kind of fuzzy, but what was crystal clear to me was that he was radiating joy, just immeasurable joy. And I think that's the essence of being in the presence of the Lord. In the presence of the Lord, there's joy forevermore. And so, yeah, I think we need to grab a hold of that. And we're not really good in the West with dealing with death and with our own finitude.
I mean, I watched my brother die in the hospital, screaming with pain. He minister, had 2 preteen kids. I mean, gave up really lucrative teaching profession for doing this, and you think, why?
Right.
It was better off for him. And it's a funny line, and I use it, but it's really true. The worst they can do is kill you, and that's good.
That's right. Yeah, it's true. It's true. And so I think I would add to that argument, to that response, and I think you're right, Bruce. I think we as the church need multiple responses, and from my own experience, I think our first response often should be silence. Silence and comforting presence, I think is more valuable than all of the well-intended but misplaced words in the world. But also, I think one of the things I've seen in my own life over and over again is that because God is sovereign, God can take the worst things that happen in human experience and still bring something very beautiful out of it. And not only can he, but he often does. And that's a key theme I think in the resurrection is that there's hope in the present because God is at work. Jesus is risen. He's glorified, and he's at work in the church, continuing to transform this world that we're in.
And we need to live for that.
Yes, absolutely.
And 2 Peter 1 talks about that he has provided so that we can participate in his nature.
Yes.
And the more we're transformed, the more we participate, the more we see that there is so much more.
That's right. So if we were to wrap all this up in a final thought about evil and suffering, Dom, what would you say?
Well, I think just from what you two discussed, there's no question in my mind that something that's so profound, at least to me, is that to deal with tragedy and grief and evil, one has to have a personal walk with the Lord that's tangible. Mm-hmm. I think there's no question being in the Word, but the experiencing the presence of God. I mean, I have a child, and I have another one on the way, and I'll be very honest. I can't imagine sitting here and speak with the composure that you two gentlemen just spoke with in regards to the loss of a child. The only thing I can understand is that you truly believe, and you truly believe because God Almighty has become a part of your life, not just philosophically, but I think ontologic, like who you are as a person. The new creation, the Galatians 6:15, is essential in your life. And I still don't understand the problem of evil. I still struggle. I love Bruce's idea of a disordering of order.
Absolutely.
I'm going to remember that. I'm going to
good.
take away.
Yeah,
That was huge.
I think that's good.
But for me, it was very profound, I think, in the sense of understanding that the only way to truly, the real witness is men and women of God walking through that loss with the same fervor and desire to exalt the name of the Lord in spite of it.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
It's
Excellent.
heavy. It's heavy, fellas.
Can I toss in one quick point?
Bruce, final word.
When my daughter died, lots of people came up to me and said, great ministers, people who knew stuff, said, I don't know what to say. And I think one of the places the church has fallen down is we need to teach people so that they have stuff that they can rely on. When you're walking down the hall of the hospital carrying your dead baby at 2 a.m. is not the time you should think about the problem of evil.
That's right. That's right. I couldn't have said it better. Hey, and to all of our listeners out there, we want this show to be something that interests you, and we want to deal with issues that are important to you, our listeners. And so if you have ideas that you would like us to discuss, we welcome you to send those in to sorrynotsorry@gmail.com, and we would love to talk about the issues that you're dealing with.
Cool.
Don't you think?
I'd love
That'd
to
be
hear from
fun.
people. Yeah, seriously.
Let's do it. So send us some emails, and we'll be happy to address them on the air.
That's it. Cool.
Awesome.
That'd be great, actually.